I first met my friend Trent at the Oregon Woodturning Symposium a year and a half ago. And he sent me an email earlier this fall asking if I wanted any oak turning blanks. And I said, sure. So I went out to his place, and a third of this oak tree, it's the trunk that's behind the two that you can see in this image, had come down in one of our September windstorms. You can see the hole in the fence that it left. And he said that he was going to have the other two parts of this tree taken down and wondered if I wanted to mill those up into oak slabs. And I said, sure. And he wondered how much of the tree I wanted. My eyes being a little bigger than my stomach, I said I would take all of the pieces up to where the branches split, 30 or 40 feet of trunk basically, times two. So at the time there had been a lot of trees down, and they were going to need a crane to bring this tree down. So it was going to be a little bit of a wait for the equipment to actually bring the rest of the tree down. So I took some of the turning blanks from the first third of the tree that had come down. I really wanted to see how this oak turns. So I cut up some of the pieces that I had, and I put a big chunk on the lathe. It's really heavy and feels really dense. This piece was about as much as I could lift to put onto the lathe. And I was curious to see how well it would actually cut on the lathe. I found that as long as the tool was sharp, it cut fairly well and really nicely and left a nice surface. And the wood was really pretty. I usually poo-poo oak a little bit because the grain is kind of strong and it tends to get overused in crappy furniture. But this wood is really pretty. So I made a quick bowl blank out of this big chunk. Once I had the outside shape, I could turn the piece around and carve out the inside. I had to stop for a couple of days, and I actually tried for the first time the method of burying the wet bowl blank in its own shavings to keep it from drying too quickly. And that seemed to work. It sat for 2 or 3 days, and I put it back on again, and it was fine. I really try with these now to get the thickness of the walls and the bottom all even or equal. That seems to keep it from cracking. And I coated it with wax paint. So that can now sit for a while, years. The tree was finally taken down, and they left 8-foot sections to be milled up. So I got the saw ready. I haven't used it in a little bit. And I got everything together that I would need. I have most of my milling stuff together, so it's not too hard to get it all packed up. My fear is I'm going to forget that one little thing that I need. I find that milling with the chainsaw tends to need a bunch of different tools, and if you're missing any one of them, the whole operation is off. It feels a little bit like I'm going to the moon, and I need to make sure that I have everything. But in the end, I did, and it was fine. So this is what it looked like with the tree down. And we started the first log, and I think I had the thickness wrong. So we stopped, and I adjusted that. Or not wrong, but just not quite what we wanted. So we milled the first top off the first log, and that went fine. And we decided we would do the ladder and mill the first cuts on a few of the logs before we got into actually slabbing the logs up. So we attach the ladder to the log with screws, and that gives us a straight edge to cut against with the chainsaw mill, so that we get a nice straight first cut. And then that first cut can be used as we go through the log to make all of the slabs. This third log had a eye hook in it, I think for a chain or something that was attached to the tree. So we tried to get that out, but I decided I needed my second chainsaw, and we moved on to a different log. And we attached the ladder, and we cut off the first piece. And this was all going fine. It was sawing well. I was a little bit nervous because the oak is so hard and dense, whether the saw would really cut it that well. So then we got into actually cutting the slabs, as we had 3 logs topped at this point, and it went considerably slower. I figured the log is thicker at this point, which slows things down, but it was going really slow. I decided maybe the chain needed sharpening, so I sharpened the chain as best I could, and we did the second slab, and it was also slow. Maybe a little better, but it was still really slow. And it felt a little bit like the saw was struggling as well. So I wasn't really sure what was going on. This is a time lapse and it still looks slow. We did get through the second slab. Then I adjusted the chain and we lifted both ends of the log up and did a third slab, which was also slow. And that was our first log, and that's what we got done that day. So I took that home, along with a few more bowl turning blanks, and I decided I would go to the saw shop, and I talked to them about getting a ripping chain. They didn't have any ripping chain on hand, but they gave me a website where you can order it from. So I did that, and I had them sharpen the chain that I had and sharpen it properly. So on the second Saturday, which is what we're starting here, we had the same chain, but it was sharpened. And I, for some reason, didn't film or do a time lapse, but Trent did some nice close-up slow motion shots. So that's what I have for this day. So this is the same chain, but sharpened. And it definitely worked better. The other thing I figured out was that because we're milling fairly close to the ground, the air filter for the chainsaw is getting filled with sawdust. So I need to clean that out regularly. If the air filter's clean, then the saw runs a lot better. It's getting enough air. So that was some of the problem the last time we were cutting. But you can see this is cutting fairly well. It's still a little slow. It's neat to see the teeth going into the wood and actually doing the cutting. That's what we cut on the second day, which is almost twice as much as the first day. So that was just sharpening the chain and making sure the airflow was good. One thing I wanted to do was to cut some thicker slabs so I could cut those into 4x4 pieces that I can dry and use as mallet turning pieces. I've had a hard time finding big, thick pieces for doing mallets. So in a few years, when these dry, hopefully I will have some mallet pieces. Also, when I got home that second Saturday, my ripping chain had arrived. So if it had just been a day earlier, you can see how the ripping chain has far fewer teeth. There's 2 teeth on each side of the chain and then a big open space, then 2 teeth and then a big open space. If you think of a ripping blade on a table saw or on a handsaw, where the teeth are spaced further apart than a cross-cutting blade, the chainsaw chain is doing the same thing, where it's giving lots of space between the teeth. Also, the teeth are sharpened with less of an angle on the face of the tooth, so it cuts more like a ripping blade on the table saw. I went back out for the third Saturday, and we broke into the longest log, which was more than 8 feet, and we had gotten the bolt out of it. And I can attach the ladder. I took some of the bark off, and we could try out the new chain. And it's definitely a little more grabby, but it definitely cuts better. It gives a nicer cut, and it cuts faster. And bigger chips coming out of the chainsaw as well. So it's definitely doing the job of ripping more like the way it should be. On every cut we add wedges once we're down the cut a little ways, and this helps hold up the piece that's been cut so it doesn't pinch the blade, which doesn't stop the blade, but it just robs the saw of some of its power. Having a sharp ripping chain and keeping the air filter clean was what ended up saving us and making this work. It was still slow, but at least things were moving. Where I took that bolt out, the top piece is cut in half, but it didn't really damage the first slab. We wanted to top this crotch piece. We had thought, as we had 2 or maybe 3, I think we had 2 of these pieces where we had a branch splitting in the log. We were thinking we'd get that sort of beautiful fire maple, fire oak kind of grain pattern. So we thought we'd cut these, and we were sort of wanted to see what the inside was going to look like. With this one, I got it straight enough by hand that I could just lay the ladder on top, and Trent stood on the other end, so we didn't have to actually attach it to the log. I did this so we wouldn't have to go so deep, and then I didn't adjust the saw, and we cut a big thick slab, which I didn't realize until we were done. Then we went back and cut the first log and started to slab that. After the first slab, we found a twin piece of metal in the tree, like there was a wire wrapped around the tree that was smaller. So we cut that log shorter, and I just cut the metal-free section of the log. And that went quickly, as we knew more what we were doing at this point. Then back to the crotch section. What we found with this oak was that the tree doesn't seem to grow together. It's really more as though there's 2 trees mushed together at the Y. So it didn't give very interesting grain. It was really just 2 trees with a wet, mushy bit between the 2. It could make an interesting tabletop with a sort of stitched bow tie down the middle. Then we did this shorter log. The grain was pretty in this oak. There's definitely a strong center grain. And we did the best we could with lifting up one end of whatever log we were working on, which usually didn't happen until it was smaller and lighter, as we didn't really have a way to lift the log except with muscle. And we got a little bit of rain. So I brought this day's haul home. I got Calvin out to help unload the truck. He's getting really useful for this. But it makes it nice for stacking the lumber. I can put the top piece back on the stack to hold everything down. Then back out for the 4th day, which I had thought would be the last day, but we didn't finish. Unload the truck. So this log, not the one I'm moving, but the big one, this log, also has a bolt where something attached to the tree. So I can cut that out. Knowing what it is now that I have it out, I probably could have just turned it and unthreaded it from the tree. But at this point, I didn't know what it was, and I didn't want to break it off in the tree. So I wanted to dig it out. I haven't done this much, so I'm kind of making this up as I go. I cut on each side of the bolt and then just tried to remove as much of the wood as I could. And once I had it where I really couldn't dig anymore, I tried turning it, and it moved, and it came out. And at this point, I was just really hoping I hadn't broken it off. And I had a point on the end of whatever the threaded thing was. And I did. And it was perfect. And it wasn't that long. And we almost could have just started slabbing without worrying about it. But you never know what is beyond what you can see on the outside of the tree. I was trying to find other metal. Trent said his kids may have shot BBs at these trees at some point, so not that that's really that big of a deal, but that may be what's causing the little beeps. And I just tried to remove some of the extra bark. Attaching the ladder can sometimes be a little bit tricky, as you want the plane of the first cut to give you a good stack through the log so that you don't lose too much at each side. You want the saw blade to go right through the center of the tree. So most of these logs were fairly parallel or cylindrical and not conical. But this one was a little wider at one end, so I had to lift one end up. And it came apart where we cut the metal piece out, but it didn't really damage the first slab. And there was another log that we worked on. At this point, Trent brought out his jib, and I put the camera on that, and that allowed for more camera placement. It makes me want to make one of these now. In fact, I've started a drawing to cut out a jib to have in the shop, because it'd be nice to be able to have the camera over things that I can't do with the tripod. And this log went okay, except for the 2 pieces of wire that we found in the long log. We didn't find any other metal, so we were lucky in that point. So we started slabbing this log, and that went just fine. You can see how the camera is working. I can get kind of low and high shots easily with the jib. And we're back to this log that had the piece of metal in it. So at this point, I decided I could sharpen, and another great feature of the ripping chain is because there are so few teeth, it's pretty easy to sharpen because there's not that many teeth to sharpen. And we continued down that log. Once the fog had cleared this day, it was a nice sunny day. You can see how much faster in the time-lapse we're moving compared to the first day, where the time-lapse didn't even look like a time-lapse. These pieces were fairly heavy. I think I was cutting these at 2.5 inches. And we can take them out to the truck. That was everything for that day, which may have been our most productive day. I had really wanted to finish, but we didn't quite finish. We still had a few smaller pieces to do. So I brought those home, and I got Calvin out to help again. The first piece was really hard to get out. It took both of us. I had wanted to continue the stack we had started, but Calvin talked me into starting a new stack that was closer to the truck. So we did that, and which I think in the end actually made more sense. Then the 5th day, we had this one last sizable log that had half of it kind of taken out where the first branch had come down. And we were really curious as to what was under that rip. I had to cut off the chunk that hadn't ripped off. My first attempt, I think I was trying to cut off too much. Then I cut off a smaller piece. And that worked a lot better. Then we used the ladder to even up the log, instead of trying to do it by hand with the chainsaw. So we're getting closer to flat here. After the other crotch pieces we'd cut, we had our doubts as to whether the grain was going to be that interesting in this piece. This piece we're cutting perpendicular to the orientation that we cut the other crotch pieces. So we cut the first slab, and I had to set the guide really tall to get over everything. So we attached the ladder at one end, and then we just had the other end up on a piece of wood. So we had to be a little bit careful with the ladder as it was sort of just sitting there. But it worked. It's just a guide. It's not really holding anything. And there's that cut. The grain was okay, but it wasn't spectacular. And then we really only got one slab out of this, as half the tree had been ripped away. So this is that slab. We decided we sort of had another slab in half the log if we stood it up. And at this point, that end was really light, so we could get one more slab that was sort of a partial slab. And it went really quick because we really weren't cutting a whole lot. Then I worked on a second crotch section. We debated on which way to cut this up. Should we cut it up the way that we're cutting it here, or should we cut it perpendicular to that? But we decided it could at least make some kind of little tabletop with some bow ties down the middle. We knew it was probably not going to have grown together and really just be two trees next to each other. And it was. Some steam was coming out of the space between the two trunks. As this was fairly short, we could get it to a fairly steep angle, which helped in cutting. You can also see how close the saw gets to the ground and how the air filter gets full of sawdust. There were two smaller logs, and the smaller of those two we just cut in half, and Trent's going to mill up each half on his bandsaw. Because it's really just about getting the wood small enough so you can move it. And the bigger of the two small logs we got one slab out of, and two halves. So the work that I thought we were going to get done on the previous Saturday actually ended up taking a full day. But we did finally finish. Most of the wood at the end Trent kept, and I only brought home a little bit on this last day. So that was the oak tree milling saga over the last 5-6 weeks. I think we missed one day because it rained, and one day around Thanksgiving because it just didn't work. So this is most of the wood minus the 4x4 pieces I made for the mallet heads. Thanks for watching.